Today in world literature, we turn to the work of Yehuda Amichai and Amos Oz. Their focus is on the poem Sort of an Apocalypse by Amichai and Nomad and Viper by Amos Oz. Our lecturer is Professor Nikki Stiller. Yehuda Amichai is a German-born Israeli poet, internationally known as his nation's leading poet. As one critic wrote of him, Amichai is like one of Emerson's representative men transferred to Jerusalem and updated for the second half of the 20th century, a prophet who shuns the traditional role and speaks in the guise of an ordinary Jewish citizen concerned with his people and his place. Amichai first gained international attention with Amen, published in 1977, and Time, published in 1978. Two collections of verse translated by himself and the British poet Ted Hughes. His love poems, 1981, are informed by his own experiences in the Jewish Brigade of the British Army during World War II, the 1948 Israeli War of Independence, and the wars against neighboring Arab states in 1957 and 1973. In 1985, he published a short story collection, A World is a Room and Other Stories. Born in 1939, Amos Oz is considered an original and often controversial Israeli writer. Raised in a conservative, scholarly Jewish family at 15, he left home to live in a kibbutz, a communal settlement developed by early 20th century Zionist pioneers. By the 1920s, many saw the kibbutz as the ideal building block of Israel, and that the structure fostered cooperation, equality, mutual aid, and democratic idealism. As did many Israeli citizens, Oz fought both in the Six-Day War and in the Yom Kippur War. Most of Oz's fiction is inspired directly by his experiences on the kibbutz and in the army. His book, Elsewhere Perhaps, published in 1966, is considered to be one of the best representations of life on a kibbutz. His best-known work of nonfiction is a collection of interviews with prominent Israelis in the land of Israel, published in 1982.
For Israeli Jews, the nationalistic philosophy of Zionism, tempered by socialism, overturned traditional religiosity, tempered by assimilation. 2,000 years of living in other people's countries and 4,000 years of a society rooted in the Torah and the Talmud, the holy books of the Jewish people, was all of a sudden obsolete. A people who had been living the life of outsiders were suddenly insiders. A people who had lived in cities and ghettos were suddenly farmers, and the people of the book wished to reverse the clock of history and become once again pastoral, independent, to reclaim a kind of Eden, even in the long shadow of the Holocaust. Before I begin to discuss our particular writers and texts, I want to say that in Israel, politics plays a very active part in the literature. Far from its being, as Irving Howe once said of politics in the novel, a gunshot going off in the concert hall, the literature of the Middle East is for the time being intrinsically historical and political, reflecting and sometimes, I think, forging the historical identities of its peoples. You must realize that since the expulsion of the Jews from their native lands in the first century of our era, Hebrew was a liturgical language, the language of the synagogue and the study hall. Every phrase, every metaphor referred to biblical passages, to received wisdom, to the sacred text. The Bible in its language was too beloved, too beautiful. Biblical allusions could drown out the sound of the modern writer and poet's voice. The Bible was like having an overpowering father whom you revered too much and in whose presence you grew mute. Of course, poets had written in Hebrew as well as in the vernacular of every country the Jewish people had lived in. But how to forge a modern poetic voice that did not make the poet sound like a puppet or an echo of the psalmist or of Ecclesiastes? Yehuda Amichai is a translator, taking the biblical cadences and imbuing them with contemporary significance. Consider the poems in your book. The first is doggedly contemporary, with shirts and towels and kites providing all the symbolism there is. There is also a linguistic irony in that Jerusalem means a site of peace, and here, of course, it's a site of enmity. But in the second poem, we hear the voice of the modern secular Israeli whose very existence stems from the vision of the prophets, but who in half a century and more of struggle and war has come to be markedly skeptical of the possibility of peace. And I'm going to read that poem. It's called Sort of an Apocalypse. The man under his fig tree. Telephone the man under his vine. Tonight they definitely might come. Assign positions, armor plate the leaves, secure the tree. Tell the dead to report home immediately. The white lamb leaned over, said to the wolf, "Humans are bleeding, and my heart aches with grief. I'm afraid they'll get to gunpoint, to bayonets in the dust. At our next meeting, this matter will be discussed. All the nations, united, will flow to Jerusalem to see if the Torah has gone out. And then, inasmuch as it's spring, they'll come down and pick flowers from all around. And they'll beat swords into plowshares and plowshares into swords, and so on, and back and forth. Perhaps from being beaten thinner and thinner, the iron of hatred will vanish forever." The irony is immediately apparent in the title, Sort of an Apocalypse. An apocalypse is a revelation, of course, a glimpse of the divine. To have sort of an apocalypse is like being a little bit pregnant. The poem is full of anachronisms and impossibilities about the end of days. There are many biblical allusions here, but the entire work depends upon the juxtaposition of what have come to be biblical cliches with colloquial mannerisms. The poet here tries to revive the biblical dream of peace for us, for himself, and for the world community. The impossibilities he refers to, armor plating the vines, securing trees, the absurdity of war and of trying to hold on to territory, are joined with the naivete and impotence of the would-be peacemakers, as when the lamb says to the wolf, "At our next meeting, this matter will be discussed." And Amichai takes this great vision that has become atrophied and reifies it, with talk being the agent of peace, or maybe it's just weariness that's the agent of peace. But whether it's talk or weariness, the primitive iron tool of destruction is beaten into, is worn down into an implement for prosperity. Note that the most dazzling words here are the colloquial markers of disavowal. The inasmuch, the and so on, and back and forth, the perhaps, and of course the sort of the title. The anti-heroic, earthy, skeptical, unsentimental voice is the true one, the poem proposes. And so credible is the voice, so free from phoniness and bombast, I think, that we follow it right through that final reification to the last word, the absolute forever. This is an idealistic vision after all, like the vine and the fig tree, rooted in reality's soil. The novelist Amos Oz shares many of the concerns of Amichai, among these the problems of war, the problems of peace, the question of what an Israeli Jew is, and what differentiates him from a Jew in the diaspora. Of course, beneath all these contemporary issues are the age-old and universal questions of what a human being is and what he or she is supposed to do. In preparing this talk, however, I wondered how I could make the story Nomad and Viper meaningful to those of you who have only the headlines as background for the problems that afflict the Jewish state with its agricultural past and urban future, its overclass of Europeans and its underclass of disenfranchised Arabs, especially the nomads depicted in this tale. And then it struck me. This story is not only about a particular people and its current historical dilemma. It is about how we perceive and misperceive, about the powers of the imagination to create beauty and also to destroy when poisoned and perverted by fear and xenophobia. The crime in this work is an imagined one, and indeed the enemy in this work is an imagined one too. I do not mean to deny the real enmity that unfortunately now exists between Arabs and Jews in Israel, but simply to extend the implication of Oz's parable for our own society. One of the implications of this story is that both the ideal and its opposite are visionary, both products of our imaginative and emotive powers. The tie to our own society is the following. We too, I believe, have our Arabs, quote unquote. We too, as a society, envision African Americans or Mexican Americans or Native Americans, or indeed any more rural, less educated, and in the West, darker skinned group as more romantic, more sexual, more desirous, and more dangerous. We project our own longings, our own buried fantasies of sex and violence onto whatever group fills this particular slot in our psyche. Let's not forget, as we stare into our computers and watch our teachers on VCRs and lead our sanitary and sedentary lives, that we were all once nomadic people, country people, living with our flocks, and that a part of us, orderly, ostensibly civilized or citified, still longs for the open road, the drama, and uncertainty of the night. Let's review the characters and the plot of this story. The settlers, the military authorities, the whole left-brained and orderly society of the state, and the kibbutz, the collective settlement that serves here as a microcosm of the society as a whole, agrees out of humanitarian principles to admit the starving Bedouins onto the lands that the kibbutz has cultivated and which they have, in a sense, taken from the Bedouins. The Bedouins, whom people have difficulty seeing, just as the founders of the State of Israel really couldn't see that there were Palestinians living there before the decree of 1947, the Bedouins move in and bring with them a rash of petty crimes and thefts. Their unruly herds destroy the carefully planted fields, and although there is no real damage done, they constitute for the members of the community a source of annoyance and potential menace. The ideals of the community originally were those of brotherhood, ironically, with all peoples, democracy, nonviolence. But something has gone deeply wrong. Some young hotheads, grown impatient with words, which seem useless in dealing with the nomadic population, want to lash out at the nomads and drive them away by force with a cowardly sneak attack under cover of darkness. The elders, believers in the law like Etkin, and the whole course of due process on the kibbutz keep them in check until the incident takes place that gives the story its shape. Let us shift our attention to the protagonist, Gila, whom the narrator knows intimately, at least as much as anyone can know her. Gila is frustrated as a woman and as an intellectual, and I quote, Gila was a short, energetic girl of 29 or so. Although she had not yet found a husband, none of us would deny her good qualities, such as the dedication she lavished on local social and cultural activities. Her face was pale and thin. No one could rival her in brewing strong coffee. Coffee to raise the dead, we called it. A pair of bitter lines were etched at the corners of her mouth. Something is missing in Gila. As we watch and listen to her trying to shatter a bottle, a perverted symbol of the shattered glass in the Jewish wedding ceremony, we realize that she is a kind of bottle herself, the kind you use for making Molotov cocktails, and it's only a matter of time before there's an explosion. Though the orchards of the kibbutz are, quote, heavily laden and fragrant, she cannot marry. Why? She cannot marry because she cannot acknowledge the other that she is. She cannot acknowledge her own sensuality, desire, bitterness, violence. And so, although she goes to the orchards at night, seeking some kind of encounter with the other, danger, sex, and death, she cannot admit to any of these things. So what happens? She meets the Bedouin in the orchard, and then she betrays him, misleading him so that he submits to her will, and then she flees. Unable to acknowledge that he is her deeper, more authentic sexual counterpart, she accuses him of raping her. The Bedouin has not, of course, raped her. She has become like the fabled viper one rears in one's bosom, a poisonous snake. And she is not the only one. Even our decent literary narrator turns out to be a coward and a liar and joins the lynch mob, toward the end including himself in the herd as we. There may be a beauty to this kind of culture, the story implies, but if there is, it is the beauty of mourning, of cypress trees, of dust, of sterility. This viper is none other than the snake in the garden, and the punishment for harboring it is death. The story implies that the Jews in Israel have indeed become like other peoples, which was the aim of Zionism all along. It implies that they have achieved independence, but in the process have lost their innocence.
Both writers, as Dr. Stiller notes, do not provide easy answers to complex problems. Amiha provides humanistic concerns for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and expresses a desire for peace and reconciliation. Perhaps from being beaten thinner and thinner, the iron hatred will vanish forever, he writes. And Amos Oz provides a rather critical picture of life of a kibbutz, a community that, taken broadly, suggests dissension in Israel itself. Important to remember here is that the work of Amiha and Oz reflects the varied roles of a writer during periods of political unrest. 2. It is important to note that freedom of speech is allowed in Israel and that censorship is not practiced. The role of the dissident, therefore, is an object for study in that it demonstrates how different cultures deal with the voices of their writers.